Good morning, and welcome to Redeemer Lutheran Church in Columbia, South Carolina, where we're part of the ELCA. I'm Pastor Gary Lodeholt. One of my favorite classes to offer our confirmation students here at Redeemer was when we talked about Moses leading the Hebrew people out of slavery in Egypt. The students were always interested in the 10 plagues and what it must have been like to experience them. The part I looked forward to was to talk about the 10th, the one that resulted in the death of every firstborn son throughout the land, leading the Pharaoh to finally let the people go. We would talk about how the Hebrews marked their doorposts and lintels with the blood of a lamb so that their homes would be passed over or skipped in this plague. And that always gave me an opportunity to use my Seder plate. Here is my Seder plate, and something like it is used in many Jewish homes as they celebrate the Passover. There's a place marked for each part of the meal, the egg, the shank bone, the bitter herbs, and more. You see, each of those foods had deep meaning, and when they celebrated the Passover, the meal was not only the food they ate, but as they ate it, they remembered and relived the story of God entering their history to save them. As they ate, they heard the story again, and they knew it was meant for them. It was, as you might say, a story they could taste. In our churches, we are still celebrating Easter. In fact, every Sunday is meant to be a celebration of Easter, but we are still in the season of those Sundays immediately following Easter Day, and each week since Easter, our themes for these Pastor Gary Live episodes have had an Easter focus, and that continues today. This week, our theme is called From Passover to Pascha, a story you can taste. Let me explain that a little. You see, there are powerful connections between Passover and Holy Communion. More, there are powerful connections between Passover and the Easter resurrection, too. I hope to explore those connections with you this week as we continue to celebrate Easter together. But before we jump into the theme that will take us through the rest of the week, I need to talk about some words, some terms that are important. These words underlie the meaning and importance of what we will consider the rest of the week. Today I'll share these words with you, and we will dig into the meal beginning tomorrow. The first word we need to talk about is Passover itself. You may remember that God sent 10 plagues on Egypt to convince the Pharaoh to let God's people go from their slavery. Some make it clear that God was behind it. For example, the Nile turned to blood, but so did the water that was stored in pots and cisterns too. Only God could do that. One of my favorites was the 3 days of darkness. You see, the Egyptians worshipped a sun god, and it was their belief that every night their god was doing battle with the evil god, and when the sun rose in the morning, it meant that their god had been victorious. When the plague of darkness happened, the understanding would have been that their God had been defeated. It was devastating, along with other plagues like hail, boils, lice, locusts, frogs, and others. So the 10th plague was that the firstborn son of everything in the land would die. That meant people, cattle, animals, everything. Moses instructed the Hebrew people to kill a lamb and to place some of the blood from the lamb on the doorposts and lintels of their home, and the angel of death would pass over or skip that house. As the angel passed over the land, it would bypass the marked homes. It was this plague that convinced Pharaoh to let the people go at last. The title of our week is From Passover to Pascha, And many of us may not be familiar with the word Pascha. The word Pascha is related to the word Pesach, which is the Hebrew word for Passover. Literally, Pascha means Easter. So when we say from Passover to Pascha, we are using two very related words to say from Passover to Easter, but also pointing to the close connection between those two events and their meaning. That's what we'll talk about the rest of the week. But there are also a couple of more interesting words I need to mention. When I was a child, most churches had altars that were up against the back wall of the sanctuary. They were designed like chests and were meant to resemble the Ark of the Covenant. In more recent times, altars have moved away from the wall and are now meant to resemble a table, something that points to both the Passover meal as a background and brings front and center the Lord's Supper, both of them meals of salvation. When some clergy types like me go into a sanctuary and find that they still have an altar against the wall, we jokingly refer to it as a walter. That's a bit of fun, and you don't really need to remember that word. But the different kinds of altars and their meanings is. I just learned the final word I'm going to share with you today, and it's the Hebrew word zakar. In Hebrew, zakar means to remember in a way that brings the past into the present. When Passover is celebrated, it's not just a meal to remember what happened centuries ago. Rather, it's a meal that invites them into the event for themselves. They are part of God's act of salvation anew, as if it were happening and real for them now. The same word applies to Holy Communion, too. When we celebrate Holy Communion, we are at the Last Supper table with Jesus, really present, kneeling there with Peter and John and the others, with all Christians from our past and all Christians yet to be. The meal, the salvation, the presence of Jesus is real and happening there and then. Zakar. It's a word well worth remembering. So with all that underlying and fortifying our understanding, I invite you into this week as we move from Passover to Pascha. Thanks for sharing these moments with me, and remember to let this day belong to God.